It would have to be a bunch of buildings that collapse before I'd be proven wrong, because it's a huge world. And like to build a world where zero buildings ever collapse just costs too much. So it's better to have an occasional building collapse and have housing be much cheaper. Right. So that's my honest view. I know it's not popular. I know I'm not going to make big friends by saying this, but um, let me put it this way. At least you know that you can trust me. I'm not telling you something that you just want to hear. I'm telling you what I genuinely, sincerely believe, whether it sounds good or not.
Housing deregulation. Is it a fantastic idea that will make us all richer and better off? Or is it a terrible idea that will lead to environmental destruction, health and safety hazards, and ugly cities? For this conversation, I invited Professor Bryan Caplan from George Mason University back on the podcast to discuss his new graphic novel, Build Baby Build, which argues that housing deregulation will dramatically improve the availability of quality housing for everyone, while also having a large number of unexpected benefits, like protecting the environment by removing urban sprawl. As a matter of transparency, I should say that I'm personally very much in favor of limited deregulation, but in this interview, I take a moderately critical stance with my questions, as you'll see. The Escape Sapiens podcast is supported by the Andrea von Braun Foundation. If you want to have a direct impact on the success of these conversations, then every like, share, and subscribe goes a real long way to helping me improve what I'm able to offer. And now, I bring you Bryan Caplan. I hope you enjoy.
Escape Sapiens.
Let's start somewhere very basic. What is housing deregulation, and why should anyone care about it?
Housing deregulation just means removing rules on the construction of housing. Obviously, that's a wide area, and you could say, like, what does it even mean? Basically, what I wind up doing is focusing on the really big regulations that seem to be reducing supply a lot. And then I just don't say very much about the stuff that's smaller. Not that I wouldn't be happy to talk about it, but two things. It's just, first of all, it is smaller, so it's not that big of a deal. And then second of all, often there's just not that much research on the smaller things. The pickier the issue, the more likely it is that I would just have to say, yeah, that's how it seems to me, rather than appeal to some actual scholarly research.
But is it that there are specific and particular regulations that you're interested in, or in general, are you interested in deregulation?
Yeah, I say, it's definitely generally interested in deregulation. There are certain regulations that have gotten a lot of specific attention, particularly regulations against building tall buildings, against multifamily, or minimum lot size restrictions where you have to waste most of your land when you build houses, parking restrictions. But then also a lot of what's done in the literature is they just try to estimate the total burden of all regulation without specifying what's really going on. And that's something that is easier to do. It's when you look at the fine print, it's like, well, it's not really all, it's just a lot of the all, but happy to walk through that if people are curious.
Yeah, so do you have some numbers there? How much cheaper would the house that I want to buy be if we didn't have regulations to wade through?
Right. As usual, we've got the best numbers for the United States. And there I would say that a conservative estimate is, if we just got rid of those four specific regulations that I named, that in the long run, housing would be about 50% cheaper, about half the current cost. That varies a lot by area, it's important to say. Although it's also worth saying that it is not true that there are important areas of the United States where regulation barely matters. Instead, the right story is there are vast expanses of uninhabited land with little regulation. And it's like, wait, you can go and build all the skyscrapers you want in Alaska. All right, thanks a lot. But the evidence, I would say, is that if a lot of people live there, then normally there's a lot of regulation. And then the further you get from the center, then sometimes the regulation eventually stops mattering very much. Other times it just stems for 100 miles or more, like in Los Angeles.
So the numbers from what I've read, it's something like 70% of zoning in the United States is set specifically for single home housing.
Yes, I'm remembering 80, but 70 might be the right number. Yeah, so that is one very important one that just says that the only, specifically residential zoning. So it's not all land, but something like 70 or 80% of all residential land is set aside for single family homes. This is more of a United States issue because most other countries are more comfortable with at least having apartments and townhomes. But yeah, in the United States, this is one of the biggest deals. Although then we pile on top of it, not just single family only, but minimum lot size. And especially for newer places, it's common to say you got to have an acre of land or more. Alex Tabarrok's is an area where it's 5 acres. It's like, well, gee, like you can only fit one house there. No, but we just think it would be better if you only did one.
So what's the argument here that this gives everyone the opportunity for the American dream? Or why is it that the zoning is so... Why is 80% set aside for this sort of housing, which seems to me a little bit crazy?
I would say that the best way of thinking about almost all big regulation is that it exists because people think the world would be a lot worse without it. It's easy to go and say it's just people protecting their property values until you study public opinion and you realize it's not just homeowners who favor this stuff. It's tenants too. It's just a normal thing that people in our society think that you shouldn't be able to just go and build what you want. And instead, government should be breathing down developers' necks and telling them what's okay and what's not okay. When you get to the real details, then people are pretty agnostic. But even there's a lot of deference. If the government thinks that you should have a 30-foot setback for a house, then you better have a 30-foot setback for the house. Now, as to what exactly is the story about what would go wrong if you could go and build more densely? I mean, you're specifically like, why should we have single family housing? There's a bunch of things going on. One is just a simple thing of when you let people build more densely, it causes extra traffic and parking problems. Another one is, yeah.
Can I stop you there? So this is a point that I don't really understand because, okay, it's true that when density goes up, there'll be more cars on the road. But it's also true that
even that is not so clear. Maybe if density goes up, people will live next to their office and they'll just walk to work. But yeah.
See, this is where I was going. So yes, it's true density goes up, but that means also you can put in a bus line. That means you can put in a train line. So do you have actual numbers here? Will we end up with more or less congestion by becoming more dense?
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of it depends upon exactly the kind of regulation. I mean, what I'd say is if you let people build single family homes close to their work, then yeah, definitely you're going to be getting less congestion. If you think that we're going to get so dense that that people are going to be taking convenient mass transit, that for the United States requires quite a bit of optimism about how much we have our act together, first of all, because the US is a weird outlier in terms of how terrible we are at doing almost all kinds of infrastructure. I mean, some of it is just government sucks, but then the US government seems to especially suck at building trains and tunnels and bridges. And to the point of I think like 6 times the cost of comparable projects in Europe, which are still being done by government. It's not just government. Some are governments especially bad. There is also the fact that with very rare exceptions, cars are just the fastest way of traveling, even in places where we think of as having good mass transit. So yes, you said that you are living in Germany. A fun experiment for mass transit optimists is just to go and open up Google Maps and then put in different places you want to go to and from, and then compare how long it takes to get by car versus public transportation. It is real unusual, even in your very densest parts of Europe, that public transportation is actually quicker. The only country I know of where this does actually work out as optimists would like is Japan. But so I actually have spent quite a bit of time in both Japan and Germany recently. And for Germany, like I was saying, all right, well, do we want to do the car? Do we want to do the train? They're like, damn it, like the car's a lot faster for everything except the really standard routes. If you want to go to Rothenburg or Datalba, then you better get a car because the public transportation from Frankfurt's 4 hours. Japan, it really is different. I mean, also worth pointing out, which is one of my big issues, that a lot of the reason why people even use mass transit is because the regular roads are so mismanaged. What's going on? Well, we've got this fantastic technology. You've probably never seen one before, but this is what it looks like. And this is a technology which will allow us to go and...
I should just stop you and say, for people listening, you're holding up a mobile phone.
Yes. Yes. This is a technology where it makes it super easy now to go and adjust the price of driving and parking based upon real-time conditions, such that there would always be roads going the speed limit or higher, such that there will always be parking available anytime someone wants to park. And if you had that, then a lot of the current reason to go and take mass transit actually goes away because it's like, all right, well, it's cheaper, but I can go and drive with confidence that the speed will be high. I'll get to where I need to go. I won't have to worry about parking. Well, there's a great book, The High Cost of Free Parking by Donald Shoup. It has this very plausible claim. I don't remember the source, but he knows his stuff, saying that in downtown urban areas, about a third of the cars on the road are just looking for parking. If parking wasn't mismanaged, the roads would actually be a lot clearer. And it was like, man, like government really screws this up. There was an earlier time where he might say, well, it was just too hard to collect tolls. How are you going to do? Have a toll booth by every red light or something? But anyway, now we totally have technology and governments keep completely dropping the ball. And the main reason why people would want to take a train is like, well, yeah, like I don't know if I can park, or maybe there'll be a traffic jam. If we actually got the roads and parking working, then yeah, it's a little confusing. At least it could well be that people would be even less interested in mass transit than today. I don't know.
So the US is famously has crumbling infrastructure, rather. Do you have any idea of the numbers when it comes to the improvement? If you didn't have to run roads along all the urban sprawl that you have radiating out from cities, then what sort of a saving could you have on public infrastructure?
Yeah, I don't know of any decent research on that. I mean, I would always say we should be remembering the convenience factor too, and just the time saving. So cars are almost always faster, which is one of Ed Glazer's small points, but it's a big, but yeah, like he says it just very briefly, but you read it's like, yeah, of course, that's why I'm driving, is because it's faster when you consider the entire journey. Like I've got to either get in my car and go where I want and then be there, or I have to get to the public transportation, wait around for it, get on it, then get off, then go and somehow get to wherever I'm finally going. But the general idea that cars are subsidized in the U.S., I think it's probably wrong because you've got a lot of transportation dollars raised from taxes on cars, which are then used to go and subsidize mass transit. Actually crunching the numbers, honestly, would be tough. This is obviously going to be something where you really want to look at the ideological bias of whoever's giving you the numbers. There are a lot more people who sincerely believe in mass transit. And so I think that's going to be where the bias will tend to be, is pro mass transit. You can say that industry is funding the pro car stuff, although I think most of what industry funds is not so much propaganda for advancing the betterment of the industry, but propaganda for advancing their public relations. That's why BP stands for Beyond Petroleum. It's an oil company that sits around propagandizing its oil, because it's like, well, look, like the real point of this isn't to improve the world. It's for us to go and not be so hated.
Okay, so if we were to compare people today who are trying to start families, so people who are in their 20s and 30s who are trying to have that first kid, buy their first home, how does life compare to them, for them to their parents and grandparents? So how much harder is it today to buy your first home?
Yeah, if you live in a desirable part of the country, then yeah, housing affordability is markedly lower, and it's it is harder. So the best way of thinking about this, by the way, when you're wondering about connection between housing and fertility, is when housing prices are high, people keep living with their parents. That's real clear. All right. And it works internationally. It works domestically. It's just common sense. And then if you're living with your parents, you're probably not going to get married, and you're especially unlikely to go and start having kids. And the more you delay this, the more of people's fertile years they're losing. In terms of how hard it is today versus in the past, some of it admittedly is just rising standards. So if you're willing to go and live in a house as crummy as people lived in the 1950s, then maybe you could actually afford it. There is an issue of, well, how much do people even build stuff like that anymore? But that said, if you could go and get something that was up to modern standards and was also a lower share of your income, then people would be moving out at younger ages than they currently are.
So I know that this is one of your main points, and that you've also written about this in the past. You're a natalist, in other words. Why should people care about raising the birth rate, raising fertility? Because most people think of it as a problem for the environment, that it's not necessarily a desirable thing, but this is one of your main arguments. So why should we care about birth rates?
Right. Just to be clear, so my earlier book, Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, right in the title, I'm actually mostly focused on individual decision-making and what's in it for you. Happy to talk about that too. But if you're wondering, yeah, but why are you encouraging people to do this? That's where I will say, look, we all are familiar with complaints about population, and the complaints are not always wrong. However, very few of us hear about the good things of population, and the sensible thing to do when you are evaluating whether it's good for people to have more or fewer kids is to sum up good and bad, not just dwell on bad. Right. So the bad stuff that people talk about that everybody's heard, there's of course the environmental concerns. Although that's one where I'll say, yeah, if you go and read some environmental economics, they'll say, well, instead of trying to reduce population, how about you just charge people for doing things that cause problems like parking and driving and pollution, and say, yeah, fine to have people, just charge them for doing things that mess up the lives of other people. But in terms of the positives, this is where they get very little attention, but the evidence is very strong. First really big positive of population is for innovation. Basics of long-run economic growth say that the main reason we're richer is not that we've got more natural resources. It is that we have more knowledge. We have more understanding about how to use the resources that we have for the betterment of humanity. All of the physical materials that we use to make a smartphone existed 10,000 years ago. What we didn't have was the knowledge to go and combine those resources into this incredible sci-fi product. Now, so what? Well, basic fact, knowledge comes from people, and the wonderful thing about knowledge is that once it exists, it can generally be enjoyed at virtually no additional cost by an infinite number of people. Once you shoot a YouTube video, billions of people can enjoy it, and the extra cost of all those extra users is basically nothing. Thomas Jefferson had this line where he said an idea is like a candle. If I go and use my candle to light yours, mine doesn't go out. And then we can each go and light another two, and those two can, so then it can spread to everyone. So this is the foundation of modernity, is that we have a population large enough to keep giving us these great new ideas, which means that we can all bask in this incredible bounty that most of us barely contribute to. So that is what's called the idea externality. The evidence on that is real strong. Almost all progress comes from large connected areas of the world, from populous connected areas of the world. Right, that's true historically, and you can see that this is true. Like if you just do the experiment, like what happens if there's an isolated island? What happens to their technology? If you're isolated enough, you usually go backwards. You actually lose technologies. You don't even have enough knowledge workers to retain whatever you've already figured out, much less to advance it. And then if you say, well, we got all the knowledge we need, like, are you crazy? Humans still die. This is a terrible problem. Someone's got to crack this problem of death. But that's just one of many other problems that need to be solved. And so that is a big one. Another one that really generally goes without note, but it's pretty obvious when you think about it. It is easy if you live in a big city to go and list all the problems with living in the big city. There's the noise, there's the congestion. I mentioned there's a solution to the congestion, which is charge people. But anyway, there's a bunch of annoying things about living in cities. And then the question is, all right, well, fine. Why don't you just pack your bags and move to an uninhabited part of your country, and then you can get rid of all the bad things that human beings do. Actions speak louder than words. Almost nobody wants to do this. Why not? It's got to be because there's a bunch of offsetting benefits of living near other people. There's no other story that even makes sense. It's like, look, you're around other people when you have, despite the fact that you have a choice to not be, because the package is a favorable package. And yet almost no one sits around in a major city saying, you know what I love about this place? All the things that people give me. You may say that you like the specific products, but the fact that they are integrally connected to the population. It's like, I love all the restaurants. Well, why do you think that Berlin has all those restaurants? Because of the people. Without the people, you couldn't have those restaurants. So that is an indirect effect of population just as much as noise. And then say, all right, well, the package is positive. And again, and yet normally when people are deciding whether they're going to have kids, are they thinking about, well, maybe this kid will be the next Einstein, or maybe he'll cure death, or maybe he will go and allow the marginal factor that allows another restaurant to exist. Either people are being selfish, which is the normal thing, or they are focusing only on the negatives. How can I bring a child into a world knowing that he'll go and cause some carbon emissions? It's like, yeah, that plus some other good things. Right. So I could definitely go on this in a lot more detail, but I would say that the general position that on balance, bringing people into the world is doing the rest of humanity a favor is very strongly true. Doesn't mean that there aren't any negatives, but I'll say that the positive outweigh the negatives at where we are. And secondly, that the negatives are easy to deal with some minor tweaks, whereas the positives, really, you need the people for them to happen.
I would say personally that the environmental impact of children is grossly overstated, at least in the West, because you're importing people to fill that gap from low carbon places where they would have a lower carbon footprint.
Mm-hmm.
Not
that many. I mean, not Japan, right? So I mean, to be fair to Japan, they have their immigration share has gone from or foreign-born share has gone from about 0 to 4 in 20 years. But yeah, like if they just were to go and have strict immigration controls, then their carbon footprint would be going down. My previous book is on immigration and how great it is, but I would say that the right argument to make about immigration is not so much as inevitable that if we don't have people if we don't make people, we'll import them, right? Because it's not really inevitable. That is a matter of policy, but rather that poor countries are going to develop eventually. And the worst environmental impact actually is when countries are middle income. And if you just let countries develop normally, there is no way to go from low straight to high. You must pass through this really dirty middle period. But immigration, on the other hand, is like economic teleportation. It does allow you to take a low income person and instantly turn them into a high income person. And then this way we can skip the dirty middle income period. So that's my story for immigration.
But okay, so let's assume that people don't have a problem with birth rates being high and they think it's a positive. What are the other benefits? So you talk about social mobility and a few other aspects. So what else do we get for free with deregulation?
Yeah, great question. I mean, probably the main reason why I actually wrote this book was that I realized that there were a lot of problems that seem really unrelated to housing, where the evidence actually says that housing deregulation would go and make a big dent in them too. That's why chapter 3 of the book is called The Panacea Policy, which is poetry. Obviously, housing deregulation will not solve every problem, but it does make a big dent in a whole bunch of problems besides the obvious one of making housing cheaper, which, by the way, in turn, that has a second, pretty obvious pretty obvious effect, which is just raising living standards. Because if you can get the price of housing down by 50%, housing is a large part of your budget. So if you make it cheaper, you don't just make one good cheap, you make overall living standards a lot higher. But some other benefits of housing deregulation that I talk about in Build Baby Build. Just to start, a lot of people worried about inequality. Housing deregulation is a really easy way to reduce inequality or raise equality. Why? Because housing is what economists call a necessity. Poor people spend a larger share of their income on housing, which means that when you get the price of it down, you are giving a larger benefit to people that are poor because they're spending more of their money on it. Smaller benefit to people who are rich. And that is by definition increasing equality. If you give a larger percentage gain to the poor than to the rich, then you have reduced inequality. Similarly, tenants tend to be poorer than owners. For owners, deregulation is a mixed bag. Mm-hmm. Many people think that it's a clear-cut loss, and that's wrong because owners have a lot of ways of gaining from deregulation. One of them is selling out to a developer. Another one is subdividing. Another one is their kids can live affordably near them rather than move 100 miles away. So there actually are a lot of ways that owners do gain from housing deregulation, but they might lose from this direct effect of prices going down. On the other hand, for tenants who tend to be poor, deregulation is just an unmitigated gain for almost all purposes, right? So we can go and get inequality down through deregulation. You mentioned social mobility. That's another fun one. In the United States, there used to be a really easy way for almost anyone to get a better standard of living for themselves. Basically, just pack up your car and drive to a high wage part of the country. This totally used to work. Now, however, it doesn't work very well because the highest wage parts of the country now generally also have much higher housing costs. This was not true in the past. What this means is that if you were to go and say quit your job as a janitor in Mississippi and try to get a better job as a janitor in the Bay Area, you actually would have a lower standard of living, not higher, because the housing cost would eat up more than 100% of the wage gain. So if we were to deregulate, we could go back to this earlier, better system where you can just go and drive to opportunity. Doesn't mean everyone will do it, but it means it's an option. It's an option, which, as I point out in Build Baby Build, Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath notwithstanding, normally this worked. Right. In the book, of course, the Okies have to drive to California and it just gets worse and worse and worse. And it's terrible. But in real life, normally, the reason why people drove to California was to get a better life, and it normally worked. Now, however, would not work very well. Now people are bizarrely fleeing California to get lower wages. But it does have this benefit of higher living standard because you get those housing cost savings. See, some of the other things that I talk about.
Yes. Can I stop you there and just
absolutely.
Focus on this topic for a second? Do you have any idea, so this stifling of growth in highly productive areas, do you have any idea what the knock-on impact is for GDP across the country?
Great question. So there was a very famous paper by Shea and Moretti that came up with some pretty high numbers. And then I found some mistakes in their arithmetic, which they conceded. But the mistakes actually made the numbers higher. So I'm like, all right, that's pretty good. But now there's a professor named Brian Greeny who says that he's found even more fundamental problems with the paper. So this all came out just as my book was about to go to print. I'm like, God damn it, what do I do? So I put a warning sign into the main text and then a detailed note explaining what's at stake. What I would say is at this point, I don't think that we have any really good actual quantitative estimates anymore. It's reasonable to think that they're large because we know that there are large differences in what economists call total factor productivity between different parts of the country. And we know that these wage differences would normally provoke substantial migration. And then you can just go and basically take out your napkin and start doing the basic math of if we were to go and move 10% of the population of the South, which has low total factor productivity, or better. I think the Rust Belt now probably is still the South is probably the lowest part. But, move 10% of the population of the South to the Bay Area where their productivity is, maybe 50% higher, total factor productivity. It's a special measure that actually just says like the same person, can be just produce that much more. Anyway, so if you just go and do that math and say, if we were to go and just move 10 or 20% of the country from where they are to a place where the productivity is 50% higher, how much would we get? And that is honestly where I would start. Probably the big problem with the Shea and Moretti piece is they made some modeling assumptions which wind up driving the result. And there's other ways you could have done the same thing. So, this is actually very similar to immigration. We've got sophisticated models giving us an estimate of how much gain we would actually get from letting people move from countries where their productivity is low to countries where productivity is higher. But I always like to just start with, all right, how much money if we were to go and say move a Nigerian from Nigeria to the US, what is our best estimate of how much of a raise he would get? And then what's our best estimate of how many Nigerians would like to move? And I would just start with that as a ballpark estimate from what's on the table. And that does wind up giving you a pretty similar answer to the sophisticated models. But honestly, I would rely upon the napkin more than the model.
And so what is that number?
Let's see. For immigration or for housing?
For housing. Let's stay on this.
So the honest answer is I need to go back and double check the numbers. I think it's totally reasonable to say 5 or 10% gain. It does depend upon how many people would move, of course. When you're talking internationally, the wage gaps are so vast that we know that there will almost certainly be massive movement. When you're talking domestically, the wage gaps are in the range where probably a lot of people would move, but it's not like half the population of the South would relocate. But I think it wouldn't be that hard. Maybe I should do a blog post just doing the back of the envelope thing. In fact, I realized, gee, why didn't I do it?
I can link to that in the description if you
yes.
put it up.
Yes. Yeah. So like if we just imagine 5% of the low productivity people moving to, let's say, moving to the high productivity people, and then just assume other things stay constant. I think that would definitely be in the range of raising productivity by 5 to 15%, I think, for the country, for the whole country. But yeah, I should do that.
But okay, so all of these impacts on housing prices, why couldn't we get the same effect or even a larger effect from, say, so your approach is deregulation, but we could, for example, put price caps on rents, or we could invest in social housing. Why are these approaches less favorable?
All right, so the price caps on rent is really easy to understand what's wrong with it. The problem is we don't have enough housing. Saying that you can't charge more for housing does not actually create more housing. In fact, in the even medium run, probably even the short run, it reduces availability of housing because there's less reason to build it. And if you are someone that could, say, rent out an extra room or whatever, you may say, in that case, I don't feel like it. There is this great line from economist S.R. Lindbeck where it roughly goes, aside from bombing, rent control is the best known way to destroy a city. Right? There's just a lot to that. Right. It's the kind of thing, it's very crowd pleasing. There's just some rich jerks who are making housing really expensive. But look, think about it not as rich jerks, but power hungry jerks who went and strangled the supply of housing. And that's why it's expensive. And that is a better model. And then to go and make it really hard to build stuff and also say that you can't charge a high price is a great way of, first of all, getting very little additional housing. One of the main reasons why anything gets built right now is that in the high price areas, builders are sitting there saying, if I can just get all the paperwork signed, I will be rich. And that's why people make the effort to get over all that paperwork. It's like, God damn it. I'll be so rich if I can just get through this entire horrible regulatory process. If at the end you are going to be capping prices, then it's like, gee, what's the point even? This is hopeless. And there's no real light at the end of the tunnel. Yeah. So rent control is one where, since it almost by definition doesn't build anything, it doesn't solve any fundamental problem of scarcity of housing. For building government-owned housing, this is one where at least I will say it's in the right ballpark. Credit where credit is due. It's like, well, we need more. People don't have enough houses. Let's build some more houses, and why not have the government do it? There, I'd say the main issue is that we've got a long track record of what happens when government does this, and it's got a bunch of problems. Costs are usually a lot higher because they are not trying to figure out a way to squeeze out the most output from the same amount of input. This is a textbook benefit of markets. It's one that even economists don't really talk about that much, but it's a big deal. In a functional system, the person that is managing it is trying to figure out a way to get the most amount of output for the least amount of inputs. Government generally does not work that way. Instead, it's more of what would be fair. And so you wind up considering a lot of things other than just getting as much housing built for the lowest price. Like we need to go and consider that people need jobs. So let's go and feather bed this and hire more workers that we need. Or we need to go and do domestic sourcing of our materials because America. And so then you wind up getting higher costs that way. Right. So public housing is a bad record on cost, also a bad record on quality, because if it is not owned by the occupants and also there isn't a profit maximizing landlord that is concerned about future rentals, then maintenance is bad, quality is bad. The main thing that I've heard in favor of public housing is just it works in Singapore. I do have a whole paper on Singapore, so I do know something about it. It's like, all right, look, basic fact. Should you base your prediction of what will happen with public housing on the most successful country on earth or on what has actually happened historically in your own country? So yeah, base it upon the history of the historical performance of public housing in your own country. And second of all, if you do go and study Singapore, there's some good reasons why it works better, namely that if you really understood it, a lot of people would say it's not really public housing. It's some weird thing that is neither fish nor fowl. A big part of Singaporean public housing is that the occupant actually does own it, and if they make it nicer, they can resell it at a profit. So it's really the government builds it and then they sell it to you. It's not like what we think of as public housing in other countries where you just have a cheap but crumbling property. So yeah, so I say that is a bad idea. And especially like for people in the US to be talking about this, like the private sector has already built over 99% of housing. Never heard a human being saying, you know what my dream is? My dream is to live in public housing. The only reason you do it is because the government's subsidizing it. Right? Otherwise, you'd rather take that money and go someplace else where you get better value for your money. Right? As to why people like it, so like in this argument I was having where the guy brought up Singapore, it was just a capitalism versus socialism debate, and the guy just had an axe to grind against private developers who make money delivering stuff that people like.
So one of the criticisms, though, that I've heard of housing deregulation, people say, and I don't know what the proof is for this, but they claim that it's going to lead to gentrification, and that really what's going to happen is we're going to end up with condos and high-end apartments built somewhere, and really you're not going to be helping the little guy. The benefit is going to be sort of weighted heavily on the upper end. Let me just add to that in the same argument sort of couples with, does it really improve the environment? Because it could be that we end up with denser, cities that are less environmentally impactful, or it could be that everyone just goes out and ends up with a holiday home in addition to their city dwelling. And so it's hard for me to tease apart whether you're heading in a positive or negative direction here.
Let's see. Wait, so remind me. So the environment was the one before that?
So the first one was gentrification, and the second was environment. Of course.
Yep. Okay. All right. So first of all, the gentrification point of when people build new stuff, it tends to be nice. That's true. Right? It's true that when you build stuff that is new, it tends to be nice. Right? Especially, of course, if it's super hard to get permission to build, because then it's like, well, who's going to live in this area where prices are really high? It's going to be people that are rich, and they're going to want high quality stuff, and I'm going to go and build high quality stuff and sell it to them. Right? So far, so good. What's wrong with this story is that it's only looking at the direct effects. The indirect effects are critical here, as they often are in markets. So you go and you build some really nice new luxury stuff. Who moves into that? Who moves into it? Well, it's going to be some rich people, right? All right, now, what happens to the places those rich people used to be living in? Well, they're not going to be vacant. You're going to go and rent those to somebody else. There's going to be people that are a bit less rich than the first group. And then who's going to go and live in the places that the second group moved in from? Well, those are the people that are less rich than that group, and so on. So economists call this housing filtering. It's called filtering. I like to think of it as just musical chairs, except instead of taking away chairs, you're adding chairs.
Can I stop?
Let me finish that thought. Absolutely. So, the idea is, so if you keep adding musical chairs, but the chairs are of different quality levels, it is going to be the faster people that still end up in the nicer chairs. But if you keep adding chairs, this does mean that there's going to be something around for the people that are not so good at the game. And that, I think, is the right way of thinking about it.
Okay, so the thing that I find interesting here is that people who are critics of deregulation, they call this trickle-down housing, and they're critical of this point, and they label this as a negative effect. But I don't understand their argument. Are you able to explain what their argument is, and in some sense steelman it? Because I don't get it.
Yeah, I think for most it is the simple argument of they aren't thinking about indirect effects. So that is just the way that most people are. It's not something that is unique to these particular people or anything like that. The normal view is, you say, all right, building this new thing, that's great for that person, but how is it great for anybody else? And it's like, well, there's these indirect effects, right? Now, when you call that trickle-down housing, it's like, okay, well, it is in the ballpark of a trickle-down argument, although the language trickle-down is itself prejudging things. In my immigration book, I say, well, it's the economic gains of immigration. It's not trickle-down. It's more like Niagara Falls, where the indirect effects are most of the effects. And so it's like the trickle-down effects of letting farmers grow food. It's like, yeah, well, the farmers get something out of this, but the main effect is that we don't all starve to death. It's an indirect effect of allowing the farmers to run a farm, but it's the most important effect of letting them run the farm is that there is food in the stores for us to eat. If you wanted me to steelman the argument, let's see. I think it would probably be along the lines of, look, there's going to be some indirect effects, but until you very strongly prove that these indirect gains to the very worst off people exceed the losses, then I'm just going to be against it as a matter of some kind of precautionary principle, something like that. So that's probably where I would go if I wanted to stand up for it. I think another thing you might just say is, look, it's best ideology to say that these indirect effects are real. Prove it to me. This is where the people that are working on this have a point that I think is pretty much unanswerable. And it's like, well, look, take a look at the vintage of the housing that low-income people live in right now. When was it built? And you will generally see that low-income people are living in homes that were built in the more distant past than people that are high income. And the question is, imagine that we had listened to people like you 20 years ago. Then people wouldn't be able, then 20 years ago, the homes that low-income people are living in now wouldn't exist. So this is not just some kind of weird theory cooked up to rationalize the developers' interests. It's just hard fact that everything gets built at some point in time, and then on average tends to be occupied by lower and lower income people the longer that exists. Yes, you can keep doing such fantastic maintenance that it remains luxury, but the natural tendency is for things once built to gradually get worse. You're pushing more and more against the tide the more you try to keep maintaining an older place. And so eventually it's going to be where people with lower income wind up living. And that's how those homes get built. It would just be weird to say, we're going to go and build something that is fantastic, and then it's going to be occupied by the very poorest people. It's like, well, wouldn't it make sense for them to go and live in something that isn't as ritzy, so that and then we don't wind up using up high quality stuff on someone that doesn't really appreciate it that much and has higher priorities in their life than having granite countertop.
I suppose one argument that could run along these lines is you could be worried along the gentrification angle that housing which was socialized might be torn down and replaced with a mansion or something like this, or that if you had zero regulation, you might end up with people buying houses that will really be bought by people who can't afford anything else at all. So you'll end up with a shoebox with no windows, with electrical faults, this sort of thing. But I suppose this is a bit of a red herring, though, because you're not necessarily going to be targeting every regulation. You're really most interested in things like single-family homes, inefficient use of land, that sort of thing.
Right. I mean, so here's the thing: is like if someone really were hyper focused on a Rawlsian idea, we should only go and get rid of regulations that help the worst off people. This is where I'd say, all right, fine, that's your philosophy. Let's go down and think about what deregulations to prioritize. Right. So the one that is a complete no-brainer is minimum lot size. It's like, look, it's pretty much always saying that there is a minimum amount of land that you can put a home on. The bigger that minimum is, the more reason you have to, well, first of all, the cost goes up because you are making people buy extra land. Second of all, when you are required to do a lot of land, then the more land you have, the more reason you have to put a big house on it. So it would be much better for low-income people if builders were just free to go and squeeze as many houses on it as the market will bear. And the way that it works currently is builders basically always go up to the limit. They put, like, if the government says you can put 10 homes on this lot, they put 10 homes. They'd like to put 11. They'd like to put more, because a key empirical finding is that home buyers generally do not put much value on the unusable land, or land you can put a volleyball court on. They like it, but they don't like it that much. So profit maximization would dictate putting in a lot of homes, each with very little land, even if they're going to be single family. So that's one where it's just clear that the status quo is bad for people with low income, because you would be doing a larger number of smaller, cheaper homes without the regulation. Similar things hold for multifamily, because multifamily, it's all about going and just putting in a lot of smaller units. And there's a reason why people live in smaller units, which is it's cheaper. Right? You can have a luxury apartment, but it's not as luxurious as having a mansion. That's where it's like, okay, well, there's trade-offs, and yeah, I'd like to have a big place, but that was nice. But if it's either a big place that's crummy and remote, or a small place that's nice and it's conveniently located, then I'll go for the small one. And again, this is a very big part of regulation, is just making it really hard to build multifamily housing. So those are places where I would say it's obvious to start. And even the parking regulation too, like low income people less likely to have a car, more likely to be doing public transportation. So when you say that everybody has to have every builder has to have multiple parking spaces, that's raising the cost, and it's raising the cost in a way that low income people are less likely to appreciate. So you're basically saying that low income people have to pay for parking spaces whether they like it or not. Whereas with deregulation, it would be up to the builder. Do I feel like offering this as an option? If you don't want the option, that's fine. Let's see. So that's the main stuff I would say there, is that there are some, at least a lot of the regulations, they're very clearly harmful to the poor. If you're paying attention, you say, all right, fine, how about we make it a maximum lot size? And that's the best. It's like, all right, you're right. 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 At least in principle, maximum lot sizes are what people that care about the poor could push for. I mean, they're the best. I'll say is, there's like a slippery slope, and like it'll just be abused. And but anyway, it's like, all right, in principle, yeah, then that's something you might want to do. Or you could say like ban single family developments. There is sort of a lingering suspicion whenever you praise multifamily that your ultimate agenda is to get rid of single family homes. I don't think that there's many people that are actually like that, but still, if you really were just a Rawlsian saying we should make regulation optimal for the very worst off, then you might say, yeah, let's just ban single family housing so that all you do is multifamily. This is just so far from the status quo. I would also just say, like, we can cross that bridge when we come to it. You also mentioned environmental effects. So this is one where I'm
impressed that I don't have to remind you here.
Yes. So this is one where it's complicated. The best paper that I know of is by Ed Glazer and Matt Kahn, where they just did a lot of arithmetic, really. And they just said, all right, well, let's go and look at particularly the carbon costs of different kinds of construction in different parts of the country. And there's a few punchlines. So one is that urban living is cheaper than suburban living. So that is some modest gain. Another one, though, that has gotten less press, but which is just as well established, and I think is even bigger according to their math, is that new construction is greener than old, despite the fact that it's bigger. That last clause is important. It's not just that new construction has a lower carbon footprint if it's the same size. It's that new construction has a smaller carbon footprint despite its larger size, because new stuff is just built with better insulation, better materials. And so that goes and gives you some gain there. And then the other big thing they talked about is that bizarrely states that have especially low carbon footprints for residents, most notably California, bizarrely have done some of the strictest housing regulation. And as a result of it, we have big population outflows from California to other parts of the country. California is basically the place that environmentalists should want to have a population of 100 million because they got the best weather, which means then you are using up very little artificial heating and cooling, right? But if California goes and makes it hard to live there, it doesn't mean that people just go and live out in the streets and don't use electricity. It means they move to other states with worse weather, and then they wind up going and doing more environmental harm. Right. So that's, and in particular, so you see with California, they've got a weather advantage, which means that it is, it is better globally for people to be living there. But then they combine it with this localist idea of, we don't want anyone harming the planet here in this particular spot. And it's like, well, what do you think happens? People just leave and then they do more.
So I understand the arguments qualitatively. So I understand if you increase density, you don't need services running out into the middle of nowhere, and so you have a positive impact on the environment there. And I understand that if you have cheap housing in places where you don't need air conditioning or heating all year round, then that's also another benefit. But I don't know how you can weigh it against the fact that when building is cheap, people will do more building, and building itself is damaging. So how do they weigh these two sides?
So basically, so what Glazer and Kahn do is the easiest thing. They just look at what actually exists,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so they see, look, when people so they basically they're comparing actually existing new homes to actually existing old homes, and actually existing new homes have one problem, which is they're bigger, and so that's going to mean bigger carbon footprint. But they also have better insulation, and then they look at the net, and the net is that they have a lower overall carbon footprint. Mm-hmm. You're correct that is this the epistemologically perfect thing to do? It's not, of course, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, essentially what they're doing is saying, well, look, if you let people build more stuff, it's going to be like the existing new stuff, and then they're going to tear down old stuff and people live in new stuff instead. And that is reasonable, though you're correct. It's not bulletproof.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So then let's look at a few criticisms, right? There's...
Yeah.
Well, there's...
criticize.
There's two that I'd like to touch on that I think... well, actually, the first one I just am very curious about what your answer would be. And the second is I actually don't know how to answer myself. So the first one is, people argue that it's not a problem with housing availability because if you look at even the worst cities, so the worst offender, let's pick out New York City. I did a quick search beforehand, and I'll also give you what I think my answer might be here, which I think is probably not the way that you would go. But so if you look at the numbers, New York City has something like 1.4% of its housing unoccupied, something like this. And if you look at the rate of homelessness, it's something like 0.9% of all people in New York are homeless. And so my response to this would be, well, you're not just trying to solve homelessness, you're trying to hit all different sections of your population base. But so what would your response be to someone who's coming out with an argument along the lines of, we actually have enough housing, look, you can fit all the homeless inside the housing that's already available?
Yeah. I would just start off by saying, all right, let's back up. Why do you think that apartments don't have, or that all apartments don't have a 0% vacancy rate?
They're being repaired.
Yes. Yeah. So sorry.
They're being repaired. There's turnover that takes time to implement.
Yes.
That's what I imagine the answer is.
Yeah. So look, there's a reason why the vacancy rate is greater than zero. It's not just that there's someone running apartments saying, I'm just going to go and deprive people of good housing because I'm a mean jerk. There are practical reasons for having a vacancy rate. Mm-hmm. All right. And, the same thing goes, of course, when you are selling homes. There is a time lag between we have built the home and it's ready and we found a buyer that wants to move in. And you can imagine a fantasy AI world where everyone gets matched instantly. And so the second someone moves out, another person is moving in at the same time. But that's not the way the real world works. There is a practical reason for vacancy rates. And just like there's actually a practical reason for having a positive unemployment rate. The world is just not organized and cannot be organized in such a way that people move in and move out on the same day. So there's always going to be a positive vacancy rate. And then the question is, if you let people go and build more stuff, what do you think is going to happen to that vacancy rate? And it's well, in the short run, there'll be a higher vacancy rate. But in the long run, what happens is that you no longer have these practical benefits of the vacancy rate. And so it's well, gee, before I had a vacancy rate of a couple percent because of logistics. Now I have a vacancy rate because of logistics, plus it's hard to get customers to go and pay me the current market rent. Gee, what could I do to get more people to go and occupy my place? Gee, damn it, what could I do? Oh, right, cut the rent, which is the standard thing that people in the business do when they're having trouble selling. Having a vacancy rate greater than zero is something where it's well, yeah, of course there's going to be some, and that by itself doesn't mean that I'm overcharging. But if you've got a lot of vacant apartments, that's where the common sense business response is to cut rates, not out of charity, not to be a nice person, but to make money, to stop making zero money on your vacant apartments. You cut the price, and then you make more money by asking for less. This is the basics of economics. So anyway, that's the reason why vacancy rates exist. And once you understand why they exist, then you realize that deregulation is a way to go and get prices down. Are they going to fall down so much that homeless people will be occupying them? That I think depends a lot upon where you're talking about and what kind of homelessness you're talking about. There is this very good research showing that absolute rents are a good predictor of homelessness, right? So this is absolute rents. Now, part of this is you have to think about, well, what is our definition of homelessness anyway? Normally, when you get a high number, this is counting anybody that doesn't have a permanent address. So whenever you hear about millions of homeless people, well, that includes someone who's sleeping on his brother's couch, someone who's couch surfing from friend's place to friend's place. But then there's the narrow measure of actual street homelessness, where normally there you do count someone who's in a shelter. So it's like, it would be weird if someone living in a homeless shelter didn't count as homeless, right? Anyway, I think the reasonable position here is that making housing cheaper is a totally viable solution to the broader definition of homelessness, because one of the main reasons people sleep on a brother's couch or stay with friends or whatever is because they've got low income, and so they don't feel like it's enough to go and get their own place. For actual street homelessness, the kind of deregulation we would have to do is not it's just going and having a free like doing the things I'm saying. I don't think is much a solution. The point that a lot of this is caused by irresponsible behavior or mental illness, depending upon your philosophy of mind. Anyway. There are some more specific kinds of deregulation, things like legalizing dormitory housing, like really cheap housing. And I think that it is reasonable to say that that would actually solve at least some of even the really severe kind. But definitely, if your concern is just with the big number, then yeah, making housing cheap is a totally viable solution for that. Like the thought experiment we're doing, where we just go and move all the homeless into all the vacant places. And this is one where it basically is ignoring not only why anything is vacant, there's reasons for having things vacant, but also this is not going to be a practical long-term solution, because the people that, in that case, the people that you're measuring as homeless probably have severe behavioral issues. And so, yeah, they are going to trash the place. They're going to be tenants that are very difficult for other people to live near. And it's a problem.
I think also it will be true that if you make housing cheaper, then it's also cheaper to build social housing, right, in general. So the approach does...
So, like that sounds good, although probably not. Here's the thing. If we have a big building boom in the private sector, where's the government going to go and get its workers from? There'll be massive competition for those workers. And then...
I see.
Yeah, so I think, this actually does go back to actually another greatly understudied gain of housing deregulation. We got a lot of evidence that, especially in the US, that there's one demographic that's done poorly in recent decades, and these are non-college males. Non-college males. My dissertation advisor, Ann Case, with Nobel Prize winner Angus Deaton, has this book called Deaths of Despair and the Future of Capitalism. They've got a lot of evidence just that this demographic is doing poorly. Their story, which I think it does make quite a bit of sense, is that non-college males have not adapted to the new economy very well. There are a lot of service sector jobs for them, but they don't like those jobs. They don't feel like manly, real work. And then you sort of have a choice. Either I do some work that is kind of humiliating for me, or I just become part of this oppositional counterculture. The most extreme version, of course, is I just become a criminal and end up in jail. There is this national conservative effort to revive manufacturing through protectionism in order to go and give non-college males back their traditional lifestyle. All right. But a bunch of my friends make fun of these national conservatives and say what idiots they are. I want to say, look, that's not a constructive thing to say when we got something much better to say to them. Namely, look, I've got a better kind of industry for non-college males to move into. Housing. Look, there is a good economic reason why manufacturing has declined. It's not primarily international competition. It's just that productivity got so high in manufacturing that we don't need many workers to manufacture anymore. People do not want to own 5 television sets. So there's just there just isn't that much more for manufacturing workers to do. We're close to satiated on manufactured products. But there's another kind of traditional, manly, macho work that is, even to this day, done largely by non-college males, and that's construction. And this is a great industry to expand because most people would like to have a better house. A lot of people, if the price were right, would like to have a house twice the current size, 3 times the current size. mean, this is not something like televisions. I don't want 5 televisions. Would you like to have a 5-bedroom house? A lot of people like, yeah, give me the 5, but like, how much does it cost? If someone offered, like, think about this. Suppose someone said, hey, I'll give you 5 free televisions. Would your reaction be, yeah, awesome. I don't know where I'll put them, but great. I think a lot of people at this point are like, no, I don't want 5 free televisions because it's just a pain in the neck. I don't have any place for them. No, I haven't. Like, they're worse than my existing television. It's like, what kind is it? Like, if you offer people 5 free televisions, that would be the reaction. Or like, I'll give you a second refrigerator. How about a third refrigerator? There's a reason for a second refrigerator if you got a big place. But third refrigerator, do you want a third refrigerator? Do you want a second dryer for your clothes? Right? This is just like, no, it's just like taking it. I don't want it. But if you were to go and say, how about we go and move you to a mansion? How many people, and you say, and it's conveniently located, how many people say no to that? There are some, there's people like, I'm retired. It's too much house. I don't want to do the maintenance. But the point being, this is a kind of economic expansion where there's clearly a lot of consumer demand for it. It's just being strangled off by supply. And so rather than just telling non-college males, tough luck, or we're going to go and try to keep out every foreign manufacturer and somehow turn back the clock to the 50s. But I do have a piece called Revive Construction, Not the Rust Belt, where I just go over the numbers and just show, even in very optimistic scenarios, about how much you could get employment up in manufacturing through protectionism. It's not much. Whereas I say it's totally realistic to think about doubling the size of our construction sector. That means we're going from like 10 million to 20 million jobs. It's a huge difference. So I say this is what we should be doing for non-college males. And it doesn't require spending any money. It doesn't require going and taking away people's opportunity to buy a Mercedes or a Toyota. It just means government getting out of the way so that people can go and build stuff.
And I suppose coupled with that is that if you're buying televisions, you go out and you buy your 5 televisions, they can come in quite easily on a ship. But if you are building a house, then you don't really want to ship in every brick you're using, right?
Yes, quite right. There are definitely a few people who may be right saying that there's some regulations that are making it hard to do pre-manufactured homes, right? And if you actually watch construction, there is a lot of prefabricated material. There are a lot of prefabricated materials that are used, like when they're doing the roof. You'll see that they don't actually build the roof on site anymore. They actually have been built someplace else in a factory, and then they just get assembled on site. But yes, it still is true that this is an industry where it's going to be done domestically to a large degree just because of transportation costs and such.
Okay, let's jump onto the second criticism, and this is one where I'm actually just very curious to see where you're going to go with this, because usually when I've read your writing or I've spoken with you, you're more interested on the deregulation side, and one of your key arguments has to do with supply and demand, right? This is central to your argument. And so when I was reading for this interview, I saw a lot of people saying that actually, no, we don't need to worry about deregulation. What we need to do is we need to stop corporate entities like REITs and so on going ahead and buying up properties, single occupant, like single family homes in particular. Because so in your supply demand equation, there's also the demand side, right? So if you have these corporate entities that are coming along and they're artificially increasing demand, right? Then you might think that the pricing will go up for the houses. And so you could have a regulatory approach where you say, okay, no more corporate entities are allowed to buy single family homes, let's say. And so you could go down this line. Do you have any opinion on this sort of an approach? Yeah.
Right. And there's also the nativist variant on this argument, which is let's keep foreigners from buying homes, which is the same argument. In both cases, there are some people, there are people on the demand side that's like people like, well, let's just get rid of them and then demand will go down and this will restore affordability. On the case of complaining about businesses doing it's like, well, what do you think the plan of the business is? The business isn't going to live in a home. So the plan is to go and sell or rent it to somebody else or to go and develop it. So this really does just go back to the idea of vacancy rates and what is the purpose of vacancies. And then it's like, well, does it matter whether it's a corporation that goes and manages vacant properties or whether it's an individual owner that manages vacant properties? the thing to focus on is, well, look, what's going on with the vacancy rate? And is there some strangeness about how high it is? Or is it just what you expect based upon practical logistical concerns? So yeah, so the idea that a business wants to buy it and then just hold it off the market and make no money off of it forever is pretty weird. And of course, what you want to do is to go and have somebody living there. Like, if there may be some issue with, well, like it's going to be hard to go and get rid of the tenants for a bit. So maybe there'll be some small effect there, but this really is just like a standard issue in economics where you go and blame the middleman for scarcity. It's like the middleman is someone in between the buyer and the seller. It's like, do you know who else are middlemen? Like grocery stores. They get between you and the farmer. Why do they do it? Because they are actually making life more convenient for the buyer and the seller by being the ones that actually handle the property management. In the case of the immigrants thing, that one is actually logically clearer because if you go and keep out foreigners, it does get demand down. Right. And you say, like, isn't this better for domestic people here? It's like, well, it's better for domestic consumers. It's not better for all the people that are in the industry that would like to go and have their job be to go and sell houses to foreigners. And the question is, why is it that you want to go and solve this problem of high prices by preventing people from going and building more stuff rather than by just by letting them build as much as it takes until prices fall back down to cost. Right? I mean, I say in all these cases, like any time that you are focusing on demand, I'll say that's always just a short run issue anyway. Basic way that markets work is that if demand goes up, in the short run prices go up, but in the long run, this means that prices are above cost, and prices are above cost is another way of saying cha-ching, free money here. And that's where what business wants to do is expand production in response. And then, what regulation has done is said we can't go to that second level.
But so people argue that rather than a middleman argument, what they're saying is very much in the same vein as immigrants buying up our houses, let's say. They say, well, it's just extra competition in the market for houses. That there is that extra buyer there, and that in itself is pushing up demand. And then on top of that, they say that if you look at these corporate entities, they like to buy property in highly regulated areas because they know those are the areas where prices are going to either be stable or increasing across time. So it seems like they would be. It seems like they're, from the arguments that I've read, they really are marching in line with regulation. These entities,
right? So again, I mean, here's the issue. So your business model is I go and I buy up some properties in San Francisco and then I sit on them while they're vacant.
No. They rent them out. They rent them out.
So here's the thing: is as long as you're renting them out, then you are simultaneously increasing supply and demand. +1 - 1 = 0. And it is just a middleman issue. It's like saying, does it increase demand for oranges if the grocery store goes and buys oranges and then sells them to you? It's like, no. You would say, in a sense, you could say, well, they increased the demand. They bought 100 more oranges and then they sold 100 more oranges, and so the net effect is actually nothing. As long as the middleman is renting it out to people, then it is just a pure middleman thing. They don't occupy it, so there's no reason why that should be raising prices on balance. Rather, it's just a different person is renting it out. It could be a business or it could be an individual owner. Like, what difference should it make for availability if they exist? The only real story is if you have some kind of monopoly story where some builder is so big that they buy up a bunch of properties and then they deliberately don't rent out a lot of them, which is logically possible. But for a big city, it's so unlikely that would be an issue. The immigrants, again, are the ones where it makes more sense because they're at least we're talking about letting some people in who will then actually live in them. If it is just someone that buys it to rent it to someone else, then that doesn't make sense. That would raise demand on balance.
Except that I think the argument, as I understand it, is that this changes the character of the people who are resident in the houses. So now it's more renters as opposed to buyers. And so that's the argument there, where it's more expensive now for me to go and buy a house, and it's renters in general who are worse off financially than the buyers, right?
Right. Well, so here's the thing. Actually, I mean, if that's your story, then in fact you should be really happy about this because what's going on is a corporation goes and they buy a bunch of places and then they rent them. So you can say that the supply of homes available for purchase has gone down, supply of homes available for rent has gone up. So if these two sectors are not in perfect sync, then that is actually good for renters and bad for buyers. Of course, normally renting and buying are pretty closely linked. So yeah, like I thought I was just going to go and tell you the basic economics of, look, the main determinant of rental prices is sale prices because people are weighing, well, should I rent or buy? But it is fair to say that that renting and buying prices don't always move perfectly in sync. So there must be some separation of supply and demand for these two kinds of properties, some of which is driven by regulation that makes it hard to convert from one to the other.
So if I understand what you're saying, so correct me if I'm wrong. Am I understanding correctly? You're saying that because there's more rental properties, that that increases supply of rentals, and so that makes it better for someone who wants to rent.
Yes.
And so I see.
Slightly. I mean, think about this. Like, suppose there was some business that would buy houses and paint them green, and then resell them. All right, and that's like, well, like, what kind of buyers benefit from this? People want greenhouses. What kind lose? People don't want greenhouses. All right. Now you may say, yeah, but that's not going to be a big deal because people don't care that much about the color, and the two markets are connected. And it's like, yeah, that's correct. Right now, in the case of if I buy them out and make them available for rent, that's my business model. You are marginally reducing availability for sale, increasing availability for rent. So there is some slight change, although again, I wouldn't put too much weight on it because those two markets are quite connected. To be fair, it is true that sometimes we see that, I think during COVID, rental prices were rising faster than sale prices, for example. Right, and this is a short run issue where it's like, well, gee, during COVID, a lot of people want to go and flee from their permanent place and temporarily rent a different place in a better location. And so in that case, yeah, well, rents are going to go up, and people don't want to buy; they want to rent. But then who are you going to rent it from? And so that's the issue.
Okay, so just to give you an idea of where I want to go now, I want to ultimately ask you what the practical steps are if you want to, in a realistic way, reduce regulation. But before going there, before our interview, you said you were happy to steel man some of the other side. So I just want to ask, before we wrap up, can you steel man the argument just in general for regulations? So let me just say, the idea that I have is that it's sort of death by a thousand cuts, right? There's someone who's concerned, they're advocating for disability, or they're advocating for nature, or they're worried about the aesthetics of a city. And so there are all these different small regulatory stories that are taking place for maybe lovely reasons, but it's the package combination that just creates an environment where it's impossible to build without huge cost. And then the other side, of course, is that you're not necessarily aiming at all of these different regulations. It really is specific ones that bear the burden, the majority of the cost. Right. So with that context, what's your argument? How do you steel man the case for regulation?
I mean, I say the steel man is, look, the regulations are on the books for a reason. We started off without the regulations. Then people went and did some horrible stuff that really bothered their neighbors and other people around them. And then government said, you can't do that anymore. And now we're in this world where, sure, it costs more, but at least we don't have these terrible problems. There is a fun book that I read called Zoning, written around 1920, before much of the modern regulation was in place. And the book's very convincing. He just goes through and what else is going wrong? And he says, people are building buildings as tall as they're just trying to build even taller buildings than others in order to get the light. The tallest building gets the light. So there's this wasteful race to get the tallest building. You're blocking lights. People are building too close to the street. The door opens up and bothers another person. He just has this long list of complaints. They all sound like they probably happened. It's just the question of, two questions. So one is, are the complaints really anywhere near as bad as the complainers say? And second of all, is there some cheaper, more humane way of dealing with the complaint than the system that we have? And that's what I say is, and actually third thing. And are there a bunch of good things that are coming from housing that never get any attention and aren't being balanced against the bad things? It's actually really important. right? But it's easy to go and find fault and complain, and the complaints are generally not totally wrong. They're just overstated, one-sided, and that's my view of the problem. The complaints that I would say are just undeniable are: you let someone build an apartment complex here, there's going to be more parking problems, more traffic problems. So, all right, fine. And then my response there is primarily, how about instead of strangling this industry, we just raise the price of parking and driving during peak times using totally available technology? And if you say that's not fair to the poor, what is worse for the poor? Having to go and pay extra for parking and driving, which you may not even be doing, or having to pay a lot for housing. It's better to go and make housing cheap and then have, which is the major cost, and have more expensive parking and driving, which is the minor cost, than the other way around. So yeah, like the system we have, the idea that this is better for the poor is crazy. It's like better for them that they could have cheap housing and not have, and then fine. They can't afford to park or drive. They maybe weren't doing it anyway. That's where you should be scrimping. That's where it makes sense to be focused, because it's just a much more minor purchase. So many parking and driving are the problems that I think are obvious. And then on top of it, of course, there's public education. You still usually fund at the local level. This is one where I'll just say there's something weird about. First of all, it's super unfair to not provide every kid with a great education. Second of all, we don't want any poor kids in our area. It's like, choose one, man. Right? It's like, look, it doesn't make sense to be patting yourself on the back about what a wonderful person you are for going and giving a great education to everyone regardless of income, and then fight tooth and nail to try to keep poor people out of your area. Be better to go and have much lower funding for schools so that it isn't such a burden, and then you don't mind having poor kids live around you. That's where I would come down on that. But for a lot of the other complaints, I would just consider them very petty, like the new building blocks my lights. All right, fine, but everybody blocks everybody's light. It's a city, so like we can't go and listen to people like you, or there's a bird nest that's going to have to be displaced. It's like there's billions of birds. They don't all get nests. It's Charles Darwin. We're not going to stop skyscrapers and the construction because of some birds. Let's see, and then that deep one of let's always remember all the good things that come from construction when we're talking about the bad things, right? If it was just like anytime there's a meeting, if you had to have the devil's advocate, as you do in the Catholic Church for canonization, right? So you want to make someone a saint, you appoint someone, say your job is to find everything bad that Mother Teresa ever did, just so that we know. If in every meeting, meetings are generally going to be packed with complainers, there was someone whose job it was just to say, allowing more construction is going to mean more restaurants in this area. It's going to mean that there'll be more kids that are within walking distance of your kids to play with. It's going to mean better job opportunities, and just go and just rattle it off, and then say, we can't go and stop the project unless you can say with a straight face that the bad things clearly outweigh the good things. And it's like, you can't really say that with a straight face most of the time.
I think, so if I was going to steel man the argument, this is the way I'd go about it. At least I would add this point, which is that, so you just mentioned there the impact on, say, the environment, the birds, right? They might not find nests. And you also mentioned the light. And so one thing that I find interesting about reading your book is that you clearly you value certain things personally differently to what I do. So for me personally, light is really important, and I do care about the impact on birds, right? But it doesn't matter which of these issues you point out. There'll be different people who value them differently, right? And so the argument that I would put down in favor of regulation is, if you want high density housing, you want people to live beside each other, they need to interact with one another, and they need to not want to kill each other. And so
hopefully.
And so it's very useful to have on your books written down, am I allowed to do that thing? Am I allowed to have that tree here? Like what is, like, if we have a disagreement and we're going to come to blows, like in some arbitrary fashion, which of us is correct, right? How is the law going to come down, and how are we going to mediate this in a way that where we don't need to, go somewhere else. We can live beside each other. And so I would say yes, like there is some level of arbitrariness because people value different things, but having them written down and regulated means that you at least have it written down and it formalizes things. Have you looked at this? Because I didn't see that necessarily in your book, this point.
I mean, so here's the thing. There's a lot of economists who do law and economics will say, look, we've got a choice. We can either have regulation that works the way that you say, where we just specify in advance everything you're allowed to do and not allowed to do, normally to say what you're not allowed to do, or we could have a system of lawsuits where if you don't like somebody, you take them to court. Mm-hmm. The second system is the one that regulated housing for hundreds of years in the English-speaking world. Mm-hmm. When you hear it that way, it's like, well, like the first one just seems a lot more streamlined and convenient, and the second one seems like a pain in the neck. What I would say, though, is that historical experience shows we got it right the first time. Why? Here's the problem. Human beings are just big complainers. They'll complain about anything and everything. And if you have a system that is designed to take them really seriously and to go and respond and do things about their complaints, then you wind up getting this draconian system that we have right now, where we have just totally taken the side of complainers. And we just give very little attention to all the good things that you are stopping. Instead, it's just like, let's make sure that no one who has a complaint that we don't take seriously. And actually a key part of living next to each other is we have to not take most complaints seriously, because otherwise it is impossible to live near other people. So I say the older system where you have to sue someone else is a feature, not a bug, because it's a giant pain in the neck in order to go and fight that lawsuit out, which means that most complainers just give up. And that's what we really need. We have a system where only the most serious complaints get any public attention. Otherwise, just suck it up, too bad. Like a nice example of this, at Reagan Airport, there was this hilarious study of noise complaints from the airport, and something like one individual filed over half the complaints. What we have done is create a system where it's not like everybody's complaints are taken seriously. Instead, everyone has to pretend to really care about the biggest complainers in the area. People who are just defective, neurotic people who are impossible to please, who focus on the negative. And that's what I think we have our system does right now, is we just tailor everything to the biggest complainers. And like a society like that is a screwed up society. It's just better to go and say, you got a complaint, take it in court, right? Where you have to, it's a giant struggle for you to go and do it. And oh, fine, I'll just live with it. Getting people to live with complaints is really important. And that, I would say, is a bigger feature of a civilized society. It still settles it. It just settles it in favor of tough luck, which sounds bad, but it's actually a more functional system. Right. And by the way, if you are living in a city, if you just notice all the things that other people do that are annoying that we just live with, like just someone with bad sidewalk etiquette. Yeah, it's like, what can we do about it? Well, just live with it. It's like we could have a system where everybody has to have a barcode on their head and tattooed. And if you aren't happy with the way that someone's walking, you can scan them and report them. And then there's a fine or something. You could do that, but it's better just to live with the problems we have than to go and create this giant system. And just imagine what would happen. Most normal human beings would never go and complain about anybody, but there would be a few hypersensitive, neurotic, exploitative people who would just make it their living to hassle other people about how they're walking.
Can I ask, because I don't know the system in America, once someone wins in a case, they sue someone and they win, what happens to the law? Does that become a precedent then, and that sort of institution?
So I'm not a law professor, but I do know the basics. And the answer is that normally it's the case is decided under existing law and it doesn't change a damn thing. Mm-hmm. If it is a case that is very different from previous cases, then yes, then normally the principle is stare decisis. We just decided in line with previous ones. But if it's something that's really new, then then it does create a precedent, which eventually might become new law. But again, it's just very hard to do that, which is why I believe that then in English law, the law of nuisance starts around 1200. This is basically the law where you can sue someone for putting smoke or noise or other unpleasant stuff on your property. And It does change over time, but not. But you basically have 700 years where the law does not change very much. I mean, basically the kind of things to like in the 19th century, it's like, well, what about a train and it puts out like a level of smoke or a factory that couldn't have been done previously, and then there's some rulings. Well, right, and that's basically how it happened.
Hmm. But do you know if this was the mechanism through which a lot of the regulations came into play, or no?
So no. So regulation is added on, or sometimes it supersedes lawsuits.
I see.
Right. So
It's
basically,
like
the normal judicial principle is if there's so standard Anglo-American law. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but I do know this is that statute takes precedence over the common law. Mm-hmm. So if there's 700 years of precedent saying that you have to go that like you can drive, we drive on the left side of the street, and then the legislature successfully passed a law saying we drive on the right side of the street, then courts will instantly go and say, well, the law says this. And the only issue in English-speaking countries where you've got a written constitution is there can be a court that says, well, this lower level law violates a higher level written. A lower level written law violates a higher level written law.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so then let's say so just to
and by the way, just one other thing on the regulation. Economists will also point out there is something else we could have besides lawsuits or regulation, which is taxation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's so you may say that charging tolls for driving during peak times, you could call it taxation or toll, whatever you want. Environmental economists have long been talking about how about instead of regulating how much and how you have to how you're allowed to pollute or how much you're allowed to do it, how about if we just have a price for pollution, you do whatever you want. And like, well, then why not pollute infinite amount? Because then you'll pay an infinite amount of taxes. That's why, right? So, and this has some amazing economic properties. Most notably, if you go and just charge a fee for pollution, this not only gives every firm an incentive to keep thinking about ways that they could go and cut back on pollution. It also creates a whole new innovative industry of firms that try to sell you new and better pollution abatement technology. Whereas under the existing system, step one is you come up with a new technology, and step two, you try to get the regulators to require it. Right? Much more streamlined just to have a system where there is market demand for any new abatement technology that's cost effective.
But so
yes. Oh, and by the way, and the relevance for housing is it is super rare for regulators to say you can just pay a fee and then automatically be allowed to do something.
Instead, we go through the paperwork.
Instead, we have this one where complainers always have to be appeased. We can't just say, look, the price of getting rid of one bird nest is $1,000. You paid the $1,000, so get the hell out of here. You can't complain anymore. Shut up.
In the case of the bird nest, so I have a friend in Australia who's a lawyer, and she was working on a case where a developer was going to build over some waterway, and there was a species of fish that was close to extinction, and it was a real fight for. Apparently, this development actually happened, and it was almost impossible for them to stop the development. I'm not sure what happened to that species in the end. It probably would have made the news if it went extinct, but apparently this was a case where the regulation was not strong enough. But
well, or maybe we don't need those fish, honestly. I mean, so going back to our differences in preferences, you're right. People differ quite widely in preferences, but they also differ a lot less than they claim. This is one of my favorite principles, that actions speak louder than words. I often talk about this in immigration. Someone says, well, I just prefer a homogeneous culture. It's like, well, then how come you live in a very heterogeneous area if you prefer it so much? It's like, well, like I have a good job here. Okay, you could get another job in Idaho where it's not so diverse. It's like, yeah, well, I don't want to live to Idaho. All right, I mean, how about you could just move 100 miles away? And so it's generally true that people will exaggerate how much they care about immaterial properties of goods. And when you look at how they actually live their lives and spend their money, then they differ a lot less, because all humans actually value convenience. For example, someone may say, like, I'm a committed vegan, and yet you go and look at their spending, and of course, often people say they're vegans are eating meat, right? But anyway, then it's like, do you check every product? Why not? Because all right, I don't really care infinitely, actually, and it is like it's not. It is an ugly truth. This is actually the book that I'm working on right now, all on this theme of actions speak louder than words. And when people say their preferences differ radically, it's like every now and then that's true. There are suicide bombers, so their actions say that they would rather die than let their cause lose. On the other hand, there is a vastly larger population of people who, in theory, believe that if they kill themselves, they'll go straight to heaven, but 99.99999% of them don't do it. Actions speak louder than words. They don't actually care anywhere near as much as they say. They would rather live on their knees than die on their feet. And thank God. Right?
So the thing is, I think this line of argument is in some sense, it's a little bit of a red herring because we don't need to pave over where this fish is. You know, my understanding of your book is that there really are, you know, if I was to pick out your strongest arguments, I would say that in the States, when you have 80% of your zoned land being single family homes, you know, it's set aside for single family homes.
On 1 acre lots often.
On 1 acre lots with limitations on how tall they can be and so on. You know, this gives rise to urban sprawl. It you know, pumps up the housing prices. It stops mobility. It seems to be all around a bad thing. And then I can easily look at that policy and say, this is a bit insane. And that policy has a very different character to you should allow someone to be able to build wherever they want, even at the expense of some species that might go extinct. So
You're absolutely right. Although obviously letting people build single family homes, there's endless complaints about that. There's always going to be some wildlife if it's that land that currently hasn't been developed. And if you really put infinite value on that wildlife, then yeah, you can't do it. My point is I don't think that people actually do generally care about it. There's a few that really care, but most people who say that they care about nothing more than the environment, for example, actually don't, right? And they would be living totally different lives if they did.
So
right. Let me put it this way: like if we take all complaints at face value, then I'm wrong. A big part of my book is to say that we are not going to give all the complaints that people have against housing the respect that people want them to have. I am disrespectful towards complaints in general. Doesn't mean that all complaints are wrong, but a big part of the theme of the book is the complaints that people are making are overstated, they're one-sided, and generally the people who make the complaints themselves, if you look at their own behavior, they don't believe their own complaints. It's not just me saying I disagree. You disagree with you. It's not just me that disagrees with you. You disagree with you.
So I would say let me summarize then and say that the key ideas of your book when you are arguing for deregulation are that the primary one is it's going to push down the price of housing. It's going to have
a lot
by a large amount. So it's going to we haven't mentioned this in the conversation, but it increases the standard of living by 11% or something. You have some figure.
This is all just napkin economics, just writing roughly. But yeah, right. There's a blackboard where I have Aristotle write it out. Write it out for Aristotle and Plato. But yeah.
And another thing I should mention is that in your book you have a fairly massive bibliography, right, where you actually give reference to it. But so the other main benefits, which are sort of side effects, are that you increase social mobility, you limit crime. There's the environmental benefit that you make cities more dense. You have the added benefit that you don't need services that go out to the middle of nowhere. So there are a whole bunch of benefits. So for the person who follows these arguments and believes that this is the best way to go, that really we should be aiming to deregulate, then how do we go about it? Because our current system, right, is set up such that there are many, many people who have a large share of their what they own is held up in the equity in their home, right? And so those people who vote are incentivized to block this sort of an approach. So what do you do? What is the realistic way to move forward and convince people that this is something that we should do?
So the good news is that while we do have severe political problems, I don't think we have much of that problem. So the problem you mentioned of homeowners are going to oppose any development because they know that it will reduce their housing prices. This is what almost all economists that I talk to think. A lot of normal people think it. But if we go to public opinion data, it doesn't seem to be true. Like it is not just homeowners that oppose development. It's almost all normal humans oppose development. Like why? A big part of it is that most people just deny that deregulation will reduce prices. Right? And then what's going on with that? So what I say is that, like the reason why I wrote the book is that I think that most people falsely believe that housing regulation is good for society, which is why almost everybody favors almost everything in politics. My first book is called The Myth of the Rational Voter. And there I say, look, the problem in politics is not selfish voting. The problem is irrational voting. It's people who are convinced that they know how to better mankind and they're just dead wrong. The opposite is true. And that's what's going on. Look at like any horrible civil war. Is it two sides fighting for self-interest? No, a selfish person would say, I'm staying out of this war. You can kill yourselves. I'm going to live. The problem is two sides who fanatically believe in their cause and are ready to go and shed blood over it. This is what peaceful politics is like too. It's not as, fortunately, we're not murdering each other, but the same idea, it's rival philosophies of what's good and bad for society. In the case of housing regulation, it's a widely shared philosophy. There's just very few people who, in fact, agree with me that it's good to go and let people build a lot more housing and that the complaints that people have are overstated and unreasonable and one-sided. Right? So what I'm trying to do in the book, honestly, is just change minds, move public opinion in a better direction. I think there's a lot of evidence that policy is highly responsive to public opinion, and I want to go and do what I can to nudge it. I have written this in the form of a nonfiction graphic novel, partly because I just want to get more readers. It's more entertaining. I want people to actually finish the book. So also entertainment helps. I want younger people to read it. So while you're right, I did try to write it in such a manner that active housing researchers will say I am accurate and truthful and fair-minded, but I also want it to be read not just by professors and grad students and journalists and undergraduates, but like any curious person. I mean, 5-year-olds who are precocious, I think, will read the book and get something out of it. So now, besides changing public opinion, what else can be done? Well, so I said that public opinion has a very large effect on policy. It's not the only thing that matters for policy. There are leadership effects. There is slack or wiggle room for politicians just to go and shove better policies down people's throats or sneak them past the goalie is another big one. So some of the recent deregulation that's been happening in the US is there have been state governments who, under the influence of arguments like mine, have been passing laws saying that you can't have single family zoning past the local level. Mm-hmm. Right. So this is one where they have some idea of, we care about all the people in the state. These localities are screwing over anyone that doesn't already live there. So let's tell them, make them stop. I mean, even there, I think they are being unfair to the localities in the sense of, I don't think the people in very restricted local areas actually are cackling with glee and saying, blah, ha, ha, we are screwing over everybody else that isn't already here because we hate poor people. I think that's a very unusual thought for a human being to have. It's more that the people in local areas, landowners and tenants, or owners and tenants both, are like, look, we have a lovely community and we're trying to protect it from evil fat cat developers. And then the people at state level, they are not looking in the mirror and saying, well, I happen to like the fat cat developers. Instead, they're saying, look, we are concerned about availability of housing for lower income people, and these local areas are not considering other people, other Californians, and that's why they're doing it. So that's one thing. So basically, anytime there is one part of the government that can be turned against another, if there's one part of the government that is more favorable, one part of the government that's convinced, of course, if you are a housing regulator, you can just try approving stuff. Mm-hmm. Just someone says it, yes. Some other things. So many people say the federal government doesn't really have anything to do here. The federal government actually did this weird thing in the 60s where they really tried to encourage getting local community activists involved in the approval process. Step one is, stop encouraging that. The local activists do not speak for anyone other than themselves. They, like I said, they are radical complainers. They're people who are impossible to please people who see the dark clouds and every silver lining, and therefore we should listen to them as little as possible. Just think about them as like your crazy uncle at Thanksgiving that everybody just tries to get away from. They are not receptacles of wisdom. They are not the protectors of their local community. They are people that represent a certain unfortunate personality type, and it's bad to base policy upon what they think. See other things that can be done. So of course, like there are many different levels of government. Like one of the easier ones is to say, well, we're going to go down from needing 3 levels of approval to only 2. That seems to be a pretty big deal there. I think the best story really is economists have this notion of comparative advantage. Everybody who wants to move the ball forward is likely to have a different thing that they are good at relative to their other options. All right. So I think that I'm best at doing things like writing books and doing podcasts. I don't think I'd be very good at actually testifying before a legislature. I think I'd be really bad at lobbying, but maybe whoever's listening is good at these things that I'm bad at. And I will go and write something that gets you to want to do it. And then you can actually make it happen. So that's another way of thinking about it. I mean, the main thing is just, like chipping away at regulation, both by the law as well as just by the enforcement, because a lot of it is so vaguely written, you could keep the same law in the books and yet deregulate de facto. So if you're involved and you can do that, great.
So then let's wrap up with that was the realistic approach. So what does the unrealistic approach look like? So you're magical. You can snap your fingers and do it. What is the thing that you impose magically? And in terms of the outcomes, on what timescales would you see differences, and what would those differences be?
Well, I mean, magic. Then I wave my wand and I deregulate today. Doesn't mean that there will be a new. I doubt even one new house will be built today because of that. It takes time to build houses.
And by deregulate, you mean everything?
Yeah. So in terms of the book, so like there's all the regulations I talked about where I know a lot about. If you read the book closely, I do have this big section on the slippery slope, and I believe in that. I think that the slippery slope argument is actually quite good in this area. And by allowing any regulations, we have paved the way for really bad regulations. There's a lot of regulations where you hear the case and I'll say, yeah, that's reasonable, but where's it going to end? I think it's going to end badly, and so better just not to do it. I didn't talk about this much in the book, but things like building codes. If you think that without regulation, people build skyscrapers that collapse when there's the first minor earthquake, I just think that's crazy. That's not what's going to happen. People who build skyscrapers are not going to build them in such a flimsy way, and nor will they be able to get people to occupy them. Like there are a bunch of ways that the free market provides for product quality. It probably won't be as safe as with a government where they put safety first. But that's good, because we shouldn't put safety first. We should make it one good thing out of many others. During COVID, you might remember if it saves one life, people. If it saves one life, we should keep masking forever. All right. And yeah, that is a terrible mentality that is very dominant in government decision making, but markets don't do it when markets do not do it unless they're forced to. And that, I say, is why markets are better than government, because they make trade-offs. They realize that price matters, that cost matters, that convenience matters. It doesn't mean that they don't care about safety. Of course they care about safety, right? And it's bad for reputation. You don't want to get sued. But at the same time, it does, I'm not worried about what would happen if you were to go and deregulate safety. There are a lot of ways that markets would still take care of it. I am well aware that the first time a building built without a building code collapses, it will be all over the news, and they will say this shows that Bryan's idea was terrible, right? And so, in the unlike scenario, people do listen to me. I just want to say in advance, look, it would have to be a bunch of buildings that collapse before I'd be proven wrong, because it's a huge world, and to build a world where 0 buildings ever collapse just costs too much. So it's better to have an occasional building collapse and have housing be much cheaper, right? So that's my honest view. I know it's not popular. I know I'm not going to make friends by saying this, but let me put it this way. At least you know that you can trust me. I'm not telling you something that you just want to hear. I'm telling you what I genuinely, sincerely believe. whether it sounds good or not.
Where can people find your book?
You can get it basically anywhere. So Amazon is what I normally do, but it's supposed to be in all of your standard booksellers. So you can get it there.
Build, baby, build. It's been a pleasure. Bryan Caplan, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Fantastic. And lots of great questions. Really appreciate it.